My name is Dan Rodriguez, Professor of Religion and Hispanic Studies at Pepperdine University in Malibu, California, and I'm one of the spiritual leaders at the Hollywood Church of Christ in Los Angeles. For the last 7 years, it's been my privilege and opportunity to travel throughout the United States, doing research, trying to find out why some churches are having success reaching the growing Hispanic population in our country and why others clearly are not. In 2011, my first book was published, A Future for the Latino Church by InterVarsity Press. And since then, I've continued to do research. The research I'm doing now is focusing on youth and young adult ministry among Hispanics in the United States. And I wish I could sit down with leaders throughout our fellowship, throughout our brotherhood, and talk with them about the wonderful opportunities that are waiting for them right outside their door if they'll only open their eyes. In 2011, InterVarsity Press Academic published my first book, A Future for the Latino Church. And I was excited about that because I felt like there were some voices that needed to be heard, not only in our fellowship, but beyond our fellowship. People needed to know what was going on in the Hispanic community. For many of us, too many of us, when we think of Hispanic ministry, we automatically think of Spanish language ministry. We assume Hispanic ministry is synonymous with Spanish language ministry. And what I found out in my research, spending 5 years traveling throughout this country, from South Florida to New York to Chicago, Boston, throughout Texas, and on the West Coast, where we find the largest Hispanic populations, is that the fastest growing Hispanic churches throughout the United States understand a fundamental shift has taken place in the Hispanic community. The vast majority of Latinos that live in this country, over 50 million, are native born and they're English dominant. And if we want to reach the growing population of second and third generation Latinos in this country, we have to remember one very important thing. Se habla inglés. They speak English. As I talk to people about Hispanic ministry in the United States, I notice that many people are confused by terms like first, second, and third generation. So let me just quickly define those terms for us. First generation is synonymous with the immigrant generation. The immigrant generation that was born abroad, that comes to this country, that's synonymous with the first generation. Second generation means that you were born here, your parents are immigrants. Third generation means you were born here and that your parents were also born here. And what we need to understand is that the 50 million plus Latinos that are now living in this country as of the 2010 census, the vast majority, 63%, were actually born and raised here. And if they're not already English dominant, they will be soon. And so this is going to impact our strategies and our approaches to reaching the fast-growing Hispanic populations, many of which are surrounding our old Anglo churches and African-American churches here in the United States, especially in large urban areas. As a missiologist in the United States, one of the things that I'm concerned about when I look at the Hispanic community is that the Hispanic community, particularly the second and third generation, between 16 and 30 years old, they represent one of the largest unchurched groups in the United States of America. One of the questions I get asked frequently by well-meaning, loving, dedicated members of the dominant group church in the United States is, well, if the vast majority of Latinos, like you say, are English speaking, why wouldn't they feel comfortable in our churches? They speak English. They like the NFL more than they like soccer, perhaps. They like Whataburger more than they like, tacos, perhaps. Why aren't they as comfortable in our churches as we would assume they would be if they speak English and we speak English? And I think one of the things that we fail to recognize is, number one, the cultural distance. Linguistic differences, language differences, that's just one piece of the puzzle. A larger piece of the puzzle is the cultural distance. So that a third generation Latino who may not speak Spanish at all or not speak it very well, still in many ways in her or his heart still identifies with the Hispanic community. They're still very Latino, even though they don't speak Spanish. And so you've got that identity that's reinforced by many factors, including continuing immigration, Spanish, Latino culture in the United States, especially in some of the older Hispanic neighborhoods throughout our country. That's one factor. Another factor, and maybe a more painful reality, is that when they come to many of our dominant group churches, and I was blessed, I was brought to the Lord in a dominant group church. But many of my second and third generation Latino friends, even family members, wouldn't feel comfortable in most of our dominant group churches Because many times we make them feel when they come as though they really don't belong. We say silly things like, oh, your people are meeting down in the fellowship hall. We try to practice our Spanish with them when they don't speak Spanish either. Or we say something silly like, oh, what part of Mexico are you from? And if they're not Mexican, we've really offended them. And then if they were born here, as most of them are, we've offended them again. And so we send messages to them subtly, reminding them that they really don't belong here with the dominant group. They really belong down the hall in the fellowship hall with the Spanish-speaking group. And yet, as I've just mentioned, when they're with the Spanish-speaking group down the hall, they're down there, and many of those people are saying, why don't you go with your friends? Why don't you go with your people, the English speakers in the dominant group? They don't feel welcome down there either because they don't speak Spanish well enough. They don't understand all of the cultural idiosyncrasies. They're too Americanized, or as we would say, they're too agringado to fit in. And so many of them just wander the halls if they stick around our buildings at all. Most of them just get in their cars and leave the parking lot. One of the things that surprises people who study Latino culture in the United States is that even second, third, and even up to fourth generation Latinos still primarily self-identify as Latinos. If you ask a third generation Latino, what are you? The vast majority are going to say, they're going to answer with a description of their family's ancestry. Oh, I'm Cuban, or I'm Puerto Rican, or I'm Mexican, even though specifically they are Cuban American or Puerto Rican American or Mexican American, but they're going to first identify by their country of origin, their people. And I think many of us don't understand the intensity of ethnic identity, especially among Latinos in the United States. They don't lose, many of them, that ethnic identity once they lose the Spanish. Even when they marry somebody from the dominant group, as I have, you still maintain a certain part of you that will always be Latino. That sense of identity also tends to push them or pull them into Latino churches where often they don't feel comfortable. That's why I think one of the most exciting things that I've discovered in my research in the last 5 years is that the fastest growing Latino churches in the United States are English speaking. They not only have bilingual services, but many of them, most of them have moved beyond bilingual services. Then they just started having simultaneous services, one in English and one in Spanish, so that the grandmother who didn't speak any English would feel comfortable in Spanish, but that her grandson, who didn't speak hardly any or any Spanish at all, would feel comfortable in English. And seeing these churches develop and grow. Now we're seeing another model of Hispanic churches in the United States that are English only. I was just recently down in McAllen, Texas, right on the border of Mexico and the United States. You'd assume that any Hispanic church there, of course, is going to be Spanish dominant, if not exclusively Spanish. The fastest growing church in McAllen, Texas is called the Cornerstone Church. It is 100% English speaking. They've got the largest, fastest growing youth group in that city. And it's all English speaking. It seems to defy, the way we generally think and approach Hispanic ministry. That's why I'm so excited about Genesis Alliance. Genesis Alliance gets this. They understand that the future of the Hispanic ministry in the United States is going to be different than our abuela's church. And it's going to be different than the model that we have used for the last 4 or 5 generations here in the United States, where we have a Spanish-speaking group down meeting in the fellowship hall or in a chapel while the dominant group is meeting in the auditorium. We're going to see new churches reaching new Hispanic populations in the future. And I'm thankful for the ministry and the vision of those involved with Genesis Alliance, because they're going to lead us in that path.
Very good.
When I think of the second and third generation Latinos here in the United States, I'm reminded of the Hellenized Jews that are described in the book of Acts. Those people that are first introduced in chapter 6, whose widows were complaining because they were being overlooked in daily distribution of bread. And the reason they were being overlooked was simply because of language. They didn't speak the language. They didn't speak Aramaic. They didn't hear when the announcement was made, if you want food, please report to gate number 3 and you'll get your food. It was simply because of language that they were being overlooked. They were Jewish. They were ethnically Jewish, but they were bicultural and bilingual. Many of them were Greek or Latin speaking. Their countries of origin are listed there in Acts chapter 2. And what we forget is that those people that are originally overlooked in chapter 6 by the church are not overlooked by God. God noticed them. In fact, those are the people that God uses as we follow the story of the expansion of the church in the first century. He uses those Jews who live in the hyphen between Judaism and the Greek-speaking and Latin-speaking world. He uses those Jews to reach the lost. people like Stephen and Philip and Barnabas and Saul of Tarsus and Timothy. What do all these people have in common? They're all Hellenized Jews. They were bicultural, they were bilingual. They were not born and raised in Israel, in Judea. They were raised in the Gentile world. And they were the bridge that God used to reach the Gentile world. And when I think about Latinos who are native-born, English-speaking in this country, I see them as the Hellenized Jews of today. They are going to be able to reach communities that the dominant group cannot reach, that the African-American church can't reach. They're going to be able to reach groups that their grandmother's church, the Spanish-speaking immigrant church, cannot reach. They're bicultural, they're bilingual, they're multi-ethnic, and that gives them an opportunity to reach people that other people cannot reach. So for me, the second and third generation Latino in the United States isn't just a target of evangelism. They're much more than that. They are going to be the future agents of evangelism and church growth in the United States. That's what my research is showing in the broader evangelical world, and I believe that's the future in the churches of Christ. I know that as I say things like this, some members of our churches and leaders in our churches get very, very nervous. They're concerned about their neighborhoods, the safety of the neighborhoods, the economy, employment, education, rising costs in healthcare. You know, what are we going to do with all of these people, and can we make room for them all? And while those are important questions, especially for U.S. citizens and taxpayers, members of the church who understand that their citizenship first and foremost isn't in this country, but our citizenship is in heaven, from which we are waiting our Savior, Jesus Christ. We need to be asking other types of questions. We need to be asking questions like, why are these people coming? And not just answer the question because they want free health care and education and a place to raise their children. We need to be asking another question. Could God be bringing them here? If we read Acts chapter 17, when Paul is preaching to the people in Athens, one of the things that he says about the God who made the whole universe is that the God who made the universe determined the times and places of our habitation. If these 11 plus million undocumented immigrants are in this country, and the vast majority of those are of Latin ancestry, and there are 50 million plus Latinos in this country, we need to be asking another question. Are they here because God has brought them? And if they are here because God has brought them, how should the church respond? And so at this benefit dinner for Genesis Alliance, we're going to try to answer that question. Why are they here? Why is God, if He's responsible for bringing them here? And how does He expect His people? How does He expect His church to respond? Not to a problem, but to an incredible opportunity to reach 50 million plus Latinos in the United States. I hope you'll come to the benefit dinner for Genesis Alliance. Not only to meet the future Latino leaders within our church, but to also maybe challenge some of your assumptions, myths about Latinos in general in this country. Just a couple of myths. Number one, that they're all foreign born and most of them are here illegally. That's not true. Number two, that if you want to reach the Latino community, you have to speak Spanish. That's a myth. And number three, that they're only going to be a burden to the church. We need to reach them for the Lord. We need to see them as more than a burden. They're an opportunity. They're not just targets, but they're the future missionaries, not only abroad, but right here in our country. They can go into neighborhoods that the Anglo churches cannot go into. If you want to help your church become a church that moves to the cutting edge in evangelism and in mission, not only foreign, but domestic mission, you need to come to this dinner, because we're going to be talking about how to reach one of the fastest growing mission fields in the United States of America today. Hispanic ministry is changing. It's not only changing the way we reach Hispanics, it's also going to change the way we do evangelism at all in this country. I hope you'll come to this dinner and learn how Genesis Alliance is trying to become a solution and provide a solution to churches of Christ in the United States anxious to be at the cutting edge of Hispanic evangelism and mission in the 21st century.